Welcome to our session then on the journey to creating an inclusive workplace. There are many of you on the call listening in live today, and many more are listening to this on catch up. So thank you so much for everybody that's supporting us in this session today. I'm delighted to take you on a bit of a whistle stop, action-packed tour in the next hour. Obviously, I cannot take you through all the realms of diversity and inclusion and creating inclusive workplaces. I can take you though on a journey of our insights and our experiences, my personal experience of what I have seen in the last decade or so in this space, and my lens, and it's very important to make this clear, my lens is communication. So obviously the many different realms of this topic come from policy creation to recruitment, retention, performance management, etc. And we are today just looking through the lens of communication. But that said, we have got a lot to take you through, so we are going to get cracking. So if we move on to the next slide, I can explain that we will introduce ourselves, your fantastic hosts for today, myself and my colleague. So I am Sally Pritchett. I am the CEO of Something Big and also the co-founder of Something Big about 25 years ago. In those 25 years as a creative communications agency, I and us as a business have been working with some of the world's largest and best workplaces, which means we've got huge amounts of experience, and my veteranness means that I go back further than that in terms of my communications experience. I am passionate about communications and believe that it can solve so many problems within the world, but in today's session about the workplace. Thank you for whoever's giving me hearts. That means I feel like you all get it. I'm also a passionate driver of workplace experience and workplace culture, which is really where we're going to be talking about today. And it's my mission to make the workplace fairer, healthier and happier for everyone. So I hope that you can hear that passion come through in the next few minutes as we go through this session. And with no further ado, I will introduce Felicity. Over to you.
Hello, lovely to see you all today. I'm Felicity Allen. I'm the Commercial Director at Something Big. I've been with Something Big for almost 10 years, so not quite the length that Sally has, but still a good few years under my belt, working on some amazing campaigns with some amazing brands. And I'm very lucky in my role because I get to be quite hands-on. I get to work very closely with our customers, making these meaningful differences and working with them to really understand the challenges that they're facing throughout their organizations, whether that's specifically frontline or indeed sort of the wider sort of employee landscape. So lots of the work that we'll be sort of talking about today, I've had the pleasure of being involved in from the get-go. So yeah, I'm excited to meet you all and to share some of the great work with you.
Great. So what is our agenda for today? So I cannot obviously in this 1 hour take us on a huge deep dive through diversity and inclusion. But what I would like to do is I would like to share my view on the journey that organizations take in terms of diversity and inclusion. And I'm going to already out the fact that some people will call this EDI, some people will call it DEI, some people will call it JEDI, some people will call it DEIB. My own personal version is DEIB, which stands for diversity, equity, inclusion and belonging. Everyone will have their own view of that, and I think we're all talking about a similar topic. And when I say I'm going to take you on my journey, I'm going to say this is my observation of what I've been seeing in the organizations that I work with in terms of that journey. So this is not something you can Google and go, well, there's a framework. This is the version that Sally observes, and I'm going to be fairly clear on what I think I observe. The second thing I'd like to take us through is what do I think the DEIB landscape is looking like, feeling like, etc. And again, I can't take you through the whole landscape, but I'm going to take you on my version of a sort of whistle-stop tour of that. What we're then going to do is we're going to spend the majority of the call showing you how we believe the power of communication, and many of you are internal comms professionals, which is fantastic, or you might be HR comms professionals, and we're going to show you how you can leverage the power of communication through this topic. And we're going to end with some top tips and practical, tangible things. And I guess what I really hope is that I can inspire you to feel that you've got some power in this topic, because when I speak to so many of you, I often feel somewhat of a helplessness. Sometimes there is a sense, particularly with DEIB leads, that although they're chipping away at the surface, the huge under iceberg there is quite overwhelming, and it feels like quite a heavy burden. Yeah, someone gets that feeling, and it can feel like quite a heavy burden. And so I really want you to feel today, especially on a Friday, that actually there are things we can do and we do have some power. So I'm hoping to do that. With no further ado, let's move on to my version of what I believe I see in the journey. And this is the journey I see organisations on. And while I'm taking you through this journey, I'd quite like you to be thinking about where you believe your organisation might sit in this journey. So I believe the journey starts with acknowledgement. And acknowledgement is a time where organisations go, oh, we need to do something here. We've got some problems. We might have some feedback in internal surveys, etc. Or maybe this is an acknowledgement that happened decades ago. And for some organisations, I saw many organisations started with things like International Women's Day, where they kind of felt like, oh, we're going to deal with gender inequity. And it may have started then. For many other organisations, it started around the time of George Floyd and Me Too and Black Lives Matter. And there was a huge sort of push forward at that point to start making more acknowledgement. And during this phase, we often see that this is when you might have the HR team might start introducing people that have DEI leads, or they may have a DEI team, and the discussion starts. For some organisations, it's very important for me to also mention this has not even started in some organisations. And that does sadden me, because we should be further along the line. But for some organisations, acknowledgement is a starting point. The second phase that I see is celebration. And this is often something I refer to as when we put a rainbow on it. We see a huge amount of communication, sometimes, not always, but sometimes that communication is external prior to it even being internal. So this is where we do sometimes change our logo to a rainbow, or we celebrate International Women's Day, or we celebrate Pride Month, or something like that. And we start to make statements as an organisation. I worry that sometimes at this point we haven't actually done the work and taken the action that fits underneath that. So sometimes this celebration can be what I would refer to as empty comms, not intentionally, but sometimes it is unintentionally a lack of understanding of what is required underneath that communication. So this area of celebration can be quite a tricky area. We then sometimes move into education, and this is where things start to push forward. We start to do inclusive leadership training. We might equip managers and leaders with better information. We might start doing sessions around it, unconscious bias, allyship, etc. And we start to see shifts in organisation, and I think this starts to move the dial a little. And obviously we start to see the challenges. As we move into what I see as allyship and belonging, this is where we get greater empathy, because that education has started to help the penny to drop, and people have started to go, actually, I didn't see this before. And now with this training, I'm starting to see things that I didn't see before. I have greater empathy. I'm a better ally for my colleagues in whatever underrepresented group that might be. And we start to discuss things like allyship and also belonging. And we start to talk about what it takes to have an inclusive workplace. And that, I believe, also enables us to make the conversation go from one way to two way, because during this allyship and belonging stage, we often also start to listen, which is fantastic, because communication is about both ways. And so we might bring out things like ERGs, employee representative groups, or we might have communities, or we might surface some of those stories and start listening to these stories and start sort of understanding some of the issues and hopefully taking action. And hopefully action happens all the way through this journey, but not always. And we then move into the next one, which I think is about structural institutional change. This is where we actually do start doing things like changing policies and identifying where we've got discrimination and bias and looking at things like recruitment policies or performance management, etc. And at one end of the scale, that will be just updating some policies. And at the other end of the scale, that might be understanding and even maybe self-declaring ourselves as institutionally racist or institutionally biased and discriminatory in some ways. So at this point, we have action, we have a better acknowledgement of the size of the problem. And I, perhaps provocatively, but certainly purposefully, have made the last stage green. And that's where I think I say enabling meaningful change. And why is it in green? It's in green because we're not there and we won't be there. And I think we really need to acknowledge that the meaningful change that is required in organisations will outlive us all. It will outlive our careers. It will go beyond the work that is required in our workplaces. Will go beyond the work that we can do as individuals on this call and our colleagues. And I say that because society is still structurally, institutionally, whichever way you want to look at it, discriminatory to so many. And having started my EDI, DEIB journey probably more than 15 years ago when I started working on gender equity, I can see that the change that has happened in those 15 years, there has been some, it is snail's pace slow. Frustratingly slow. And we have much more to do in other more tricky underrepresented and misrepresented groups. In particular, race. I wish we could make this a faster journey and make faster progress than we have with gender, but I still have to accept that the likelihood is that progress in all of these underrepresented groups will be slow. It does not mean that we will not make every effort to do it. And on this call today, I think we've got the power, and in fact, because we're all communicators and because we're on this call, we have appetite, so I'm even happier about that. But I believe we can make decent change. But I think that point there in the green is that we are going to this is going to outlive us. It's bigger than any of us. And I think it's really important that organisations accept that, because otherwise I fear that they think they've done it and we will not have achieved it. Okay. So what does the landscape, that's just my journey, and hopefully I will pause for talking for 2 seconds, but hopefully when you think about the workplace that you are working within, you might think about where they are on that journey. And I'll be clear about something. You might be at the structural and institutional stage level, and you might still be doing celebration, and that's absolutely fine. We do celebration, and celebration is important. You may well still be doing education. You may well still be working on allyship and belonging. That doesn't mean that you haven't got further down the line. But if you're at the other end and you're only at the acknowledgement stage, then you probably haven't done some of the other things. So on that note, I will move on to what I think is the landscape at the moment and what the parameters of this world. Now, obviously, the most important thing about the DEIB landscape is that it is hugely complex. We cannot put it in buckets. And I'm fearful that my next slide suggests that I am putting it into buckets. But if we move on to the next slide, I do believe that there are 6 very specific under and misrepresented groups. There are actually way more than that. The iceberg underneath it is way bigger than that. So I don't want to put this into buckets. But in these particular realms, there are huge levels and layers of negative, dated, unhelpful stereotypes that these communities are facing and battling and having salmon days, swimming against every single day. I think if we go on to the next slide, I want to also just talk a little bit about our younger generations. There's a delay. There we go. Oh, no, I don't want to talk about our younger generations. I want to talk about our workplace for a moment, because what's actually happening, and these are some stats, is that 26% of our employees are feeling discriminated against at work, and 83%, so the majority of those employees, are looking for a new job. And why wouldn't you? Because if you felt like every day was a salmon day and every day was a day where you felt like you had to swim against the tide, or you had to put up with a phenomenal example I was given the other day, which I thought was a really great way to describe this, is like a paper cut. Now, when we have a paper cut, it looks so minor, it doesn't even bleed, and everyone goes, how can that hurt? But if you've had a paper cut, you know it does hurt. It stings, and it continues to sting. And if you touch lemon, it really stings. And so what we really see is that our underrepresented and misrepresented groups are getting several of these paper cuts all the time. These are the little microaggressions, the moments where they're not listened to or seen, or they're not taken seriously in a meeting, or whatever it might be. And these are the little things that are paper cuts that are happening time and time again. And why wouldn't you want to give up if that's how you're feeling in a workplace? And the challenge here is that 83% are feeling like that in one place, and then they're moving to another workplace and they're shortly feeling the same. And then they're going to another workplace and they're shortly feeling the same. And none of us would want to use our hands if our hands were covered in paper cuts after a while. And so I think that is what we are experiencing in terms of these small microaggressions that are just building up. So employees from under and misrepresented communities are having a significantly poorer employee experience. And I hate that. I really hate that. So I just now do want to move on to the next slide, which is about our younger generations, because there's a stat here that I really want us all to hear. So by about 2025, so really just very soon, we will have about 27% of our workforce will be from Generation Z. But actually, what I'm really talking about here is that we have this shift in the generations that are coming into our workforce. Now, 61% of Generation Z and 49% of millennials, so that is half and more than half of these people that are already in our workplace, believe that they have been harassed in the workplace in the last 12 months. So not on a night out at the weekend, but in our workplaces, not a microaggression paper cut, but an actual harassment, and in the last 12 months. Okay, so more than half of these younger people believe that's what they're experiencing in our workplace. And this harassment includes physical advances, inappropriate emails, unwanted jokes, exclusion, gender-based undermining, etc. Now, some people will make some generational assumptions here. They will say, oh, these young people, I've experienced that in my workplace. You just have to suck it up. Well, no, we don't have to suck it up. And just because we haven't spoken up on these things in the past has not meant that behavior is appropriate in the workplace. And I'm delighted that my 3 young people that I'm bringing up will actually speak out and say, no, this is harassment. So I think the workforce has a big problem coming, because by the time we have 27% of our workforce in this Generation Z speaking up, we can either listen or we can double the size of our HR teams, quite frankly, because that's what's going to happen. So I believe we need to make a massive shift in behavior within our workplace. So I'm going to sum up with the next slide, which is, what do I believe is the state of play in the workplace? And it's a bit brutal, and it's my opinion, so you can take it or leave it. But I believe that all organisations remain institutionally discriminatory. It's at the core. And we still have a long way to go on it. That's sexist, racist, the lot. We're all the ists, okay? And that's because society is. And I don't want organisations to feel guilty for it. I actually just want them to accept it, acknowledge it, and start dealing with it. And I certainly don't want them to pretend that it isn't true. I think employee behaviour remains far from ideal, because I believe that because of poor education or empathy or awareness, or because societally accepted discrimination and unconscious bias is accepted in the wider world, so therefore it comes to work as well. And what we do in the pub or at the weekend or whatever also comes into the workplace. And I'll tell you later on how I feel that we need to move that bar. I believe that the employee experience, and thus the well-being, and that is critical for me, is significantly impacted by discrimination. And these microaggressions and structural bias is massively impacting our underrepresented groups. And I think most importantly, absenteeism, employee retention, productivity, performance, all of these things are massively impacted by this topic. And so my kind of final statement on that is this getting in the way of an organisation being successful? Yes, without doubt, it is getting in the way of success. And the number of organisations that are out there going, how can we be more successful? How can we be more profitable? How can we be better performance-wise? And yet this is not a topic that is top of that agenda, and it needs to be. So I feel like I'm going to step slightly gently down from my soapbox. And having had a really good rant, feeling like I've got it out my system. With all of that in context, our lens now is to talk about communication, because many of us on the call are communications. Whoever's not on mute, please, if you could go on mute, that'd be amazing. Thanks. So we're going to talk about how we can leverage the power of communication. Okay, so Felicity, I'm going to take a breath, and we are going to now rattle through a number of different examples and ways that you can leverage communications. Felicity, over to you.
Fab, thank you. So you set it up really nicely. I think you've given a great understanding of the landscape, but it'd be really lovely to now share some of the work that we've been doing, some other work that we've been really inspired by, and looking at how all of this sort of, can relate to making a more inclusive workplace. So the first area that we're going to look at is increasing awareness and education. And I think obviously we've even just seen sort of in the little diagram that you shared, Sally, how important education is. So hopefully that's sort of not new news to anybody. But our first example, which hopefully you can see on screen, is a great example to kick us off, really demonstrating how communication has sort of built a more inclusive workplace through increasing sort of awareness and education. And this is a piece of work that we did with Brambles. They actually already had a great campaign sort of going through the business called Altogether Different, really celebrating everybody's differences. But we've kind of worked with them to move that on into more of the education phase, creating a campaign called Friends Of. And we worked with them to really sort of demonstrate that, if we could empower colleagues to become friends of one another, and by that we mean, everybody that has all of their differences, and sort of embracing those differences and encouraging those sort of meaningful conversations, that all of that will help promote understanding, obviously support, people not feeling like they're being sidelined, and ultimately it will help individuals on their own sort of journey of diversity awareness. So this campaign was essentially designed to educate employees on the importance of inclusion, really making sure that everybody within the business could feel a strong sense of belonging. And I think, if we build on sort of the success of the initial launch, well, which we have done, we kind of went into this new phase, which was all about really highlighting and spotlighting different communities within Brambles, one of which was disability. And this was looking at both visible and invisible disability. There was definitely a need to sort of help educate and raise awareness around disability, specifically invisible disability. So we sort of developed the campaign on using lots of different ways, whether that's conversational posters, thought-provoking emails, digital screens, all sorts of things. My next example, as you can hopefully now see on screen, is another campaign that we've worked on, this time with a company called IAG Cargo, which is very much focusing on increasing awareness and education. So similar to Brambles, IAG Cargo do embrace a very diverse workforce. And what's great is they have got this sort of history of celebrating diversity in the workplace. But what we've done with this campaign is really start to sort of help them shift their focus from the celebration to targeted education. So recognising specific behaviours and biases that were in need of addressing across the business, we created a People Not Labels campaign, which ultimately just really directly challenged harmful labels and stereotypes, particularly those negatively impacting the Black community. We carefully aligned the campaign with their overarching DEIB positioning, Great to Be, which builds upon the narrative that we've been helping IAG Cargo sort of establish over the past year. And this, again, just demonstrates to the sort of commitment they have for ongoing education. And over time, this dedication to sort of awareness and inclusivity, I think, is going to really help further strengthen their employer brand, because these values will become deeply embedded within the workforce.
So I'm going to pick up on the next way that we can use the power of communication. And this is about being very clear on the organization's position. Now, you cannot declare your organization and say, we are, an inclusive workplace, and then bingo, you just are. We can't do that. However, what we can do is we can be clear about our intention. So this next campaign that we ran globally across 220 countries was for a company called DHL, and we called it I Belong. And those are two words. That's very simple. Everybody should be able to understand that this is a stance. This does not mean that this organization was suddenly 100% inclusive and that everybody within this organization, all 600,000 employees, suddenly felt that they belong. But what it does do is it makes a very clear statement for that organization to say, we want you to belong. You deserve to belong. We want you to belong and be your true self if you want to. We want you to feel safe. We see you, we hear you. We want you to be part of our organization. So what we ran across a number of different graphics here is different stories, and the campaign had a huge amount of depth to it, which we might see some of it later on as well. But we took some authentic photography for it, and we brought out some really clear stories across the organization. And the point I wanted to make today really is that sometimes it is important for an organization to decide where it is, what its stance is, and then to be very clear with using communication on what that stance is. And that is a great power that we have. So a good one for us to go and talk to our senior leaders about and say, how do we want to describe our culture? And I think one thing I'd like to say about culture here is that sometimes we let go of culture and it can get carried away with us, and sometimes we can have toxic cultures and it can get out of hand. And it's very important for us to all understand as senior leaders and as communicators within organizations that we have to take control of the culture, and part of that is about communicating the culture that we want to have. So I think it's back to you for the next one, Felicity.
It is indeed.
If you found your notes.
I have. Apologies about that, and thank you for picking up. Good teamwork. So yeah, moving on to increasing allyship, which hopefully will come on the screen. There we go. Actually, I'm going to go back and first of all look again at the Friends of campaign that I was just sharing with you. So the Brambles Friends of campaign, yes, it was a great example of education, but I also think it's a brilliant example of increasing allyship. And this is because essentially it facilitated very meaningful conversations, as I said before, sort of individual journeys of awareness, But ultimately, it fostered on a deeper understanding and sort of level of support amongst colleagues. And I think it's also worth noting again that this sort of social media look and feel that I referenced earlier, it created a very safe space that people felt comfortable in to learn and to have dialogue with people. So ultimately, it really helped to empower employees to become what we would call active allies. Another great example of that comes from DHL. And they really focused on increasing allyship within the LGBTQ community in the workplace. And they'd done a lot of celebration, which was brilliant. But they really understood that sort of genuine support meant education as well as sort of action. So, going on beyond the sort of the rainbows and things like that, they wanted to really empower allyship. And they did so through this very comprehensive campaign, which included a whole lot of different communications on a weekly basis. But one of the things which I think had so much impact and had so much gravitas was they actually created this dedicated allyship guide, which really sort of aimed to educate employees on how to sort of actively support and celebrate their LGBTQ plus colleagues. So another really nice example.
And I think it's really important when we think about things like this that, we all have our own individual lived experiences. That doesn't mean that we automatically understand other lived experiences. So this education, in order to be an ally, we really need that guide, that perspective from somewhere else. Okay, so I think we go on to the next opportunity to leverage communication. And I kind of referred to it earlier on, but I think being really clear on what is acceptable behaviour in the workplace. And I think all too often our sort of stance here, specifically from an HR perspective, would be to look at poor performance. And that's always related to someone's actual role and things like that. And often that doesn't include their general behaviour and how they talk to colleagues and other things. And I think that that's a problem for me, because we are not running a pub here or a social environment where people can go, oh, I didn't really like that behavior or culture there, so I'm just gonna leave and go to another place. This is someone's livelihood, this is someone's job, and they can't leave. So I think it's very important that we, from day one of anybody joining our organizations, are very clear on what is acceptable behavior. And as we saw with those stats earlier on, we all need to move the bar on behavior. So this next campaign for weights is a really great and very clear, I believe, example of what behaviour can be accepted and what isn't. There is no excuse for poor behaviour, and we'll flick through different examples and you can see very quickly that it is drawing a line and saying this is acceptable and this is not. And it's also just picking up on those difficult things that have been what might have been seen as grey areas. But I think we all have to understand, in the world of DEI, we're going to have to stop hiding behind grey areas. I actually don't want people to hide behind the term unconscious bias. Yes, it exists, but a lot of what we talk about when we're talking about microaggressions are not unconscious at all. So we have to be very clear about behaviour. And there's a couple of other examples here where they literally draw the line. How sexy are you? Or how are you today? Sexy. And it's like, this is know where the line is. This is sexual harassment. It's just a joke. No, it's sexual harassment. So I think this is just an example of gender challenges here that we're looking at on screen. But, these can be accepted behaviour in all sorts of underrepresented groups. But I think just showing you today the power of this communication to have an uncomfortable discussion and conversation in a workplace is powerful. So feel that power as a communicator. And I think back to Felicity for our next example.
Yeah, and actually picking up on what you were saying about sort of, hiding things away, this is, I think, something that communication can do a great job on, and that is making, the invisible, things that we can't necessarily see, visible. And, it's kind of talking about, bringing that elephant out into the room. It's making, us enable to have conversations about things that perhaps, we don't usually. And equally, it's about not judging people, by sort of what you first initially see. So another great light sort of being shone here on DHL, but I think for good reason. They did a great campaign, very much focused on sort of, invisible disability. And it's pretty clear what it is. It's obviously saying sort of you need to look beyond the surface, and some disabilities are visible but others aren't. So they were very much sort of committed to creating this fully inclusive and welcoming workplace for all. Obviously, there were some people that weren't feeling that because of certain disabilities. And I think a key part of this commitment was really recognising and addressing the sort of unique challenges that, people that do have invisible disabilities have. And I think this campaign did a great job. It really challenged misconception. It helped to sort of combat that unconscious bias that you were referencing a moment ago, Sally. And it really did shine a light on some of those sort of lived experiences of individuals that sort of have these individual disabilities. I think also the purpose of the campaign, just to sort of, delve a bit deeper, was really to encourage employees to challenge their perceptions. And it's quite striking imagery that you can see really portraying individuals, both with visible and invisible disability. And then, of course, this sort of peeling layer is what reveals the sort of unexpected truths potentially. So a lovely campaign to have been part of.
Yeah. It would have been very interesting if the government recently had done something about what happens when 46 times you try to speak up and you can't be heard. So I think visibility of these underrepresented groups is key. So visibility, making invisible visible, is another power we yield as communicators. So on to our next way that we can use communication. Empathy. Now, as communicators, you hold and yield an enormous power in what we can do here. So I believe that the way we can really move forward with DEI is storytelling, and you have the power of all these stories, good and bad, within your organizations, the lived experiences of your employees. If we go on to the next slide, yes, we can use this as celebratory. We can, and often organizations will go and say, hey, let's get a load of user generated content. Let's get a whole load of fantastic stories. And this was a sort of a montage of some of the thousands of stories that we managed to unearth during a DEIB week as part of that I Belong campaign. And this is fantastic because it's positive, right? And many of these people were saying, I do feel like I belong here. I do feel like I can be my true self, etc. But I actually implore you as communicators to go and dish the other stuff that's lurking, that's uncomfortable, because the more we make this topic personal, the more we say these are also the experiences that are happening within our workplace, the more we take those stories to our senior leadership teams, to our managers, to our colleagues, etc. The more we tell those stories, the more personal it gets. And people don't like those stories because they're uncomfortable. I was referred to as XYZ, or somebody mistook me for my colleague because we're both got the same skin color, or somebody said this to me, or these are the stories that we also need to tell within our workplace because they are there. So you do need to go and find those stories, and if they need to be anonymous to begin with and give people confidentiality and protection, then do so. But I implore you to get those stories out. Now, of course, you probably don't want to put them in a big montage like this and sort of celebrate those stories, but do take those stories and use as a communicator your power of storytelling to increase the empathy, because that will push this topic up the agenda as well. Back to you, Felicity.
Thank you. Yeah, so I think another great way we could be using communication is to, help try and myth bust some of these negative stereotypes and really highlighting sort of bias. So if we go and take another look back at the People's Not Labels campaign, I think this is a really great example of a campaign that, directly challenged very harmful stereotypes. And Sally, you very kindly picked up from me earlier on this, but it really did challenge, these lived experiences that people are and probably continue to having in many different organizations, these biases and these negative stereotypes that people just seem to hold on to and feel that it's acceptable to share. So this campaign helped to really dismantle some of those preconceptions that negatively impact sort of the Black community specifically, but we've moved this on now, and we're also looking at other sort of unconscious biases. And by focusing on confronting these sorts of labels, I think the campaign worked very well because it actively worked to expose that unconscious bias, which so often we kind of, just put underneath the carpet and just accept that it's an unconscious bias. And as you were saying, Sally, accept that that's okay, and it's not. And really promoting this sort of workplace culture where individuals are very recognised by sort of these damaging stereotypes, which we really need to change. If we go on to the next slide, this is again a really lovely example. And some of you may well have seen this. It really kind of started to gain a lot of traction over the last couple of years. They've run a number of campaigns, all sort of, with the same thread. So this is the bias cut, and a great example which highlights, bias so effectively. They actually started back in 2016 with the campaign and has sort of refreshed it over the years. But it's such a great way to just get across in such simple terms how these sort of negative stereotypes and these sort of biases make everybody think and feel differently towards people.
And I think for those that have seen it over the weekend, we have seen a phenomenal advert being launched around Down syndrome and the stereotypes that we have there. And it's a fantastic example, which we'll probably share with you in the after write-up. Okay, so moving on to our next topic. So I've perhaps provocatively again, but definitely purposefully left this one till the last, because yes, obviously we have in many organisations the opportunity, and over the next few slides you will see that we have helped many organisations with their gender pay gap reports, their DEI reports, etc. And this is a fantastic tool in our armoury to be transparent and clear about the progress we're making. And the reason I've left it till the last is because this typically is the first thing that organisations believe that they can do to communicate, and this is one of the main things we must do. And it is a very important tool because I believe that we should be very transparent about our progress. But please, it is just one of the tools, and it is a reporting mechanism, and it's something that we do once a year typically. So it is not something that we do all the time. So I think that was a good one for us to sort of finish on. But if you aren't getting enough traction with your reports, then do bring them to life more. They shouldn't be just reporting. They should be storytelling. They should be bringing all of that stuff that we've just talked about into play. So I think that we've taken you on a real whistle-stop tour, and I'm just going to make, and I'm doing pretty well on timing, so that's pretty amazing. I'm going to take you through two more sort of topics, really. One is I want to make an analogy towards a sort of best practice that might be right under our noses and we're not seeing it. So I like to make this analogy between DEI and health and safety. And that's a very odd thing to do because, of course, they're very, very different topics. But actually, let's have a little deeper dive here. So we've been doing in all organisations generally, especially those where there's lots of high risk employees or frontline, employees, etc. We've been having conversations for decades, and we've been communicating for decades about health and safety. So it's a conversation that has to go on all the time. We have to constantly educate on health and safety. Like DEI, Health and safety has a number of threads to it. There are all sorts of things from, slips and falls to dangerous chemicals and to wearing PPE and all sorts of things. So there's a number of different complexities to it, working at heights, etc. So like diversity and inclusion, it has a number of realms. But I think what's really important for me, the consequences are pretty important, right? Getting health and safety wrong is not great. Just like getting diversity and inclusion wrong is not great. And more importantly, health and safety has an element of personal responsibility and accountability. If I spill something or I see something, I need to speak up or I need to do something about that spillage, okay? Just like in diversity and inclusion, I need to be an active ally, okay? But it also requires my manager and my senior leaders to set a culture across the organisation of health and safety. So if I work in an organisation where I walk in and there is no PPE available and nobody trains me on health and safety, and it doesn't matter if you spill something on the floor, people say, don't worry about it. Well, then I believe that that's a culture that doesn't care about my health and safety. Just like if I walk into an organisation and nobody trains me on an acceptable level of behaviour in this organisation, they might not train me on allyship or unconscious bias, or my manager might overlook things and allow microaggressions to happen right in front of my eyes, and they might not say anything. And that is not having a good culture of diversity and inclusion. So I actually think as communicators, especially those of you that are working in organisations where you do have a strong health and safety culture, I implore you to look at what you've been doing for the last few decades and what communication we have, what training we have, what senior leadership culture we have, what reporting we have, and then question whether that is actually being mirrored in diversity and inclusion. That is just one thought. And on that note, with just a few minutes to go, I'm just going to sum up with some of my final tips. So what do I believe? I believe we're saying, make your communication go beyond celebration. Now, celebration is great. It sets a tone. It helps us make some underrepresented groups visible at certain times. You know, if we're going to do Pride Month, then it makes that community feel special and feel celebrated, and it gives us that opportunity. But it has not got the depth, okay? So go beyond celebration is the first thing. The second thing is I believe that actions speak louder than words. So we need those actions, right? But we also need to still spread the word. We are not having anywhere near enough conversations and conversation generally in organizations about diversity and inclusion. So if anyone is telling you that we're sort of done with that now and we've done that, we don't need to be having this conversation, don't let that happen, okay? We are so far away from finishing this conversation. The third thing is I'd like you to think about the purpose of your communication. Often, a lot, we get briefed that we're being asked to do a campaign or something, and it's to raise awareness. Well, actually, no, it's not always about just raising awareness. I don't want to create campaigns that just raise awareness. I want them to educate. I want them to improve allyship. I want them to make a statement. I want them to do more. I need them to work harder. Okay, so think about your communications and what they're trying to do, given all the things we've just said. I think the next thing is that campaigns are great hooks, and that's fantastic, but we are not one and done here. We do not do a conversation or have a campaign about Black History Month, for example, and then we're done for the year. What we need is all year round programs that work on all of this and take it further and further along the journey. And finally, I think it's important for you maybe to acknowledge what part of that journey is your organisation on at the moment, and what are you trying to achieve? If you're trying to push it forward to the next stage, if you think it's at celebration mode, then how do we move that into education? Or if we're at education mode, how do we move that onto allyship and belonging? How do I move the entire organisation? And do I have that power? Yes, you do, because communication does have that power. So those are some of my communications top tips. I'm going to take a breath. I'm going to slow down. I'm going to say to you, I hope you found this really a useful session. We're going to stop recording. And for those of you, we're 3 minutes to go. So for those of you that need to move on and go on to the next call, thank you so much for joining. And for those of you that want to stay, I'm more than happy with the recording off to open up. You can come off mute, you can put your hands up, you can ask me questions, and I hope that we can have a little bit of a discussion for those that have got time to stay.